In 1824, Concord, New Hampshire, the blackened hem of Sister Corinna Duval's habit was found clutched in the hand of a drowned apprentice from the state asylum laundry, his mouth filled with soaked paper bearing illegible ink. The sister, tall and calm with a faint scent of sulphur on her linen, denied any connection and resumed her duties the next morning. Yet within a week, a second patient was discovered kneeling and unresponsive in the hospital's disused furnace room, surrounded by carefully scorched pages labeled Black Mass Archive in Latin and French. At the time, the New Hampshire State Asylum for the Insane was praised for its innovative moral therapy and strict Quaker-influenced regimen, offering silence, order, and sobriety. But beneath its starched routines, procurement ledgers from 1827 revealed unexplained shipments of wax, black cloth, and large quantities of salt. Why did its own physicians begin refusing night shifts after 1832? Administrators at the New Hampshire State Asylum presented it as a sanctuary of discipline and healing, run by sober-minded women like Sister Corinna with pale hands and noiseless shoes. But a 1835 disciplinary hearing uncovered a misfiled patient log, listing 7 liturgy rehearsals held in the storage vaults, triggering an audit that would pull at a thread darker than doctrine. The first mention of irregular behavior came in the Winter Quarter Report of 1825, when Dr. Elias Thorne, a senior physician at the New Hampshire State Asylum, noted persistent nocturnal agitation among male patients housed in Wing D, closest to the old granary annex. Thorne's handwriting, usually crisp and firm, appeared uneven on the parchment, as if the pen had dragged through something wet. His entry was brief but precise. Dream disturbances, increased mutism, tactile hallucinations. One patient found with tongue discolored, gums bleeding salt. Vaults require further inspection. Vaults. The word had not appeared in any prior reports. The granary annex was originally part of the asylum's food storage structure, decommissioned in 1823 due to excessive humidity and infestations. Yet according to a maintenance log submitted 6 months later, candles and tallow were still being requisitioned for underground access chambers. In April 1826, a groundsman named Amos Brixley filed a personal grievance to the county administrator. He complained that his wheelbarrow, stored beside the annex, was moved repeatedly at night. He had begun marking the handle with a thin strip of blue ribbon. Each morning it was returned with the ribbon removed, sometimes coated in a fine white dust that bit at the skin. Brixley described the air near the annex as quiet as frost, yet claimed he heard a slow scraping from inside, like heavy chairs being dragged across stone. Despite his long service and reputation for sobriety, Brixley was dismissed the following month, after allegedly confronting Sister Corinna in the herb garden and accusing her of midnight tampering. His statement was filed, then sealed. He died less than a year later of exposure, after vanishing from the Concord poorhouse. By 1828, several patients in the upper wards had developed a pattern of identical speech at night. Witness accounts collected by intern physician Martha Kell included phrases whispered in Latin, though none of the patients had prior knowledge of the language. In one transcript, 3 patients murmured in synchrony, "Lux descendit, nigrum donum surgit." Kell, then only 21, submitted the account to the asylum board with a formal request for external review. Her request was denied, and she was reassigned to the infirmary baths. The baths were located just beneath the granary annex, where the pipes often gave off an acrid iron-scented steam. One of Kell's few surviving diary entries, now housed in the Concord City Historical Room, reads, "There is a line of white wax on the stone near the drain. It runs unbroken across 5 feet of tile. Someone maintains it." Sister Corinna's name begins appearing more frequently in these records after 1830. Although not officially listed among the medical staff, she presided over the evening prayer sessions and was granted access to most wings, including the laundry vaults and chaplain's quarters. Her presence was noted as calming by some, but others described her habit as always dry, even during the worst snowstorms, and her hands as always folded even while walking. A delivery invoice from February 1831, signed by the infirmary steward, lists 14 yards of black muslin, 9 pounds of beeswax, and an herbal compound for ritual fumigation sourced from Boston. The last item was crossed out in later copies. When questioned during a routine audit, the steward claimed the items were for chapel cleaning and seasonal fabric repair, yet chapel accounts show no such work performed that year. The only photograph ever taken inside the annex vaults was captured in 1833, using an experimental daguerreotype by visiting artist Almon Ware. The image, which survived only as a damaged plate, reveals an arched stone chamber with soot-streaked walls and a series of wooden benches arranged in a semicircle. What appears to be a lectern is visible in the far corner, atop a platform coated in coarse salt. The light source is unclear. Ware refused to speak of the photo afterward and died 6 months later from a blood infection. Eyewitness notes from the same year detail the observations of a visiting Episcopal minister, Reverend Dalton Hext, invited to review the asylum's religious programming. In a letter to the Concord Diocesan Office, he wrote, "Evening rituals carried out with precision, though I found the tone solemn beyond necessity. Sisters do not kneel but remain standing during all invocations. The chapel floor, recently scrubbed, still smells of old smoke. A child patient whispered to me, 'She prays to the black side.'" By 1834, formal complaints began reaching the New Hampshire Board of Charities. One letter, unsigned but written in a neat, educated hand, claimed, "There are 7 sisters, but only 6 beds occupied in the dormitory. The 7th bed remains made clean and untouched, with black flowers laid fresh each week." The author alleges this practice had continued for at least 3 years. A routine inspection was requested, but postponed twice due to poor road conditions and reallocation of county funds. That same winter, janitorial staff discovered an object wedged behind the old laundry stove, a brass-bound book sealed shut with black wax. The cover bore no title, only a series of crescent indentations, and it emitted a faint odor of rancid herbs. The asylum director at the time, Bartholomew Dre, recorded its discovery in a log, then instructed staff to hand it over to Sister Corinna. It was never seen again. The log's entry is written in ink lighter than the rest and ends with a single line, "Returned to appropriate custody." Particularly chilling are the recollections of Clara Wend, a laundress who worked at the asylum for over a decade. Interviewed in 1842 by town surveyor Elim Josiah, Clara remembered Sister Corinna's repeated visits to the drying cellars. "She never asked for help," Wend said, "but sometimes I'd come back from break and find the entire rope line cleared, folded and warm to the touch." When asked about the smell, Clara paused before answering, "Like pages burning, but the smoke was cold." By 1835, changes in patient art began to raise alarm. Physicians noted a rise in compulsive circular symbols, heavy black inks, and repetitive lines forming wheel-like patterns. One painting, confiscated from a mute boy in Ward C, depicted 7 figures in black, standing beneath an arch marked with the letter A, surrounded by what appeared to be Latin script and 3 crossed keys. Though the painting was destroyed in a later fire, a sketch copy made by an attendant survives in a family archive. The asylum records listed the boy's condition as linguistic inversion and religious mimicry. He was transferred to another institution in 1836 and vanished from public record. Later that year, Nurse Matilda Quince disappeared during the night shift. She was last seen near the annex entrance, carrying a stack of patient charts. Her shoes were found beside the stairwell. The stone landing was wet, though no rain had fallen that day. A smudge of black wax was discovered near the wall, and a single button from her uniform was embedded in it. The official cause of death was listed as presumed misadventure, and the stairs were sealed until further notice. In the spring of 1836, following the disappearance of Nurse Quince, the asylum's Board of Oversight initiated an unannounced inspection of the granary annex and its surrounding vaults. 3 officials and 1 court clerk entered the area just after sunrise. By mid-morning, 2 had exited early, citing dizziness and shortness of breath. The court clerk, Miss Lydia Ferro, remained long enough to file a brief affidavit describing interior damage, faint acrid odor, 1 broken pew, and ritual symbols etched into the stone floor beneath ash residue. She collapsed later that day from what was labeled temporary cerebral inflammation, and was confined to her home for 3 weeks. Her notes, smuggled out in a folio by her younger brother, contained only partial phrases. Latin repetitions, 7 figures, triangular burn marks on inner wall, scent of wax, not dust, but bone. The report was ultimately dismissed by the board as unsubstantiated due to illness. No further investigation was authorized, and the annex was formally declassified from the inspection roster in 1837. That same year, the number of night staff requesting reassignment increased 3-fold. A letter from infirmary nurse Emmeline Hartwell to her cousin described a pattern of disturbances. Tapping sounds in sequence like code from beneath the brickwork. Sometimes a voice clear as morning recites lines too fast for me to understand. Always ends with 3 words. Always the same voice. Female, but not Sister Corinna. In 1838, a physician named Dr. Roland Mears attempted to catalogue these occurrences. Known for his clinical precision and skepticism, Mears began interviewing patients in Ward D and comparing their nocturnal behaviors. Over the course of 4 weeks, he recorded a curious alignment. 12 patients, all isolated from one another, began to recite the same phrase between midnight and 2 in the morning. Mears transcribed it as non-lumen sed vox, not light but voice. Dr. Mears shared his findings with Director Dray. 2 days later, Mears was dismissed without formal cause, and his notebook was sealed by order of the asylum's internal committee. A single copy of 1 page survived in his personal effects, preserved in his family's possession. The page contains only a rough sketch of a key with 7 notches, and the words, "They do not sleep, they repeat." By 1839, the asylum's clergy rotation had shifted almost entirely to internal appointments. External clergy, Episcopal, Baptist, and Congregational alike, began declining invitations to host Mass or offer prayer, often without giving reasons. An internal memorandum by Chaplain Joseph Crail mentioned his discomfort with the growing silence of the sisters during evening prayer and their habit of remaining behind once services end. He described one instance in which he returned for his rosary and heard a slow chant, breathless, spoken without pause, coming from beneath the pulpit floor. He resigned the following week. That winter, a shipment of coal was mistakenly delivered to the wrong storage cell beneath the annex. The deliverymen, hired from the Thompson Yard in Portsmouth, were instructed to unload regardless. What they found was recorded in a brief sworn deposition, later filed in a property dispute. Room was not empty. Floor arranged with cloth in triangular pattern, salt across seams, burn marks on walls, told not to speak of it, told it was a ritual space for the dead, but there were no bodies, only wax figures with folded hands. The asylum denied this account and claimed the delivery was redirected to a different facility. Yet that same month, a fire broke out in the eastern laundry corridor, damaging 3 adjoining vault doors and exposing a narrow passage behind a crumbling wall. The area was sealed the next day without external report. Sister Corinna's presence remained undisturbed. She retained her post through all these disturbances, her conduct beyond reproach, her uniform pristine. Staff described her routine as unchanging. She walked the halls each evening at the 6th hour, inspected the kitchens, and paused outside the granary vault before vanishing into the underground wing. Her voice, soft and measured, was often heard through the stone grates. One witness, junior nurse Hester Lillane, recounted hearing what she thought were lessons being recited. Latin, French, and something I could not place. The tone was not instructive. It was rehearsed. By 1840, internal records show a subtle shift in institutional policy. The daily schedule included a new item marked only as R, set between meal preparation and patient wash. Staff rosters required at least 2 sisters present during this time, with no attending physicians and no notes allowed. When questioned, the acting supervisor called it reflection. Yet an internal inventory that same year showed heightened acquisition of salt, black ink, and blank-bound journals, items not typically included in hospital maintenance. In the fall of 1841, a small group of townsfolk submitted a petition to the county court requesting clarification about strange lights observed at the asylum grounds on the last Sunday of each month. The petition, signed by 11 residents including a local magistrate, described low glows triangular in shape, lasting under an hour, always from the annex window. The asylum responded with a public statement attributing the lights to candle reflection during services. However, 2 of the signatories, Elijah Braun and schoolmaster Ruth Van Nott, continued to document the phenomenon. Their private correspondence, later published in a regional pamphlet, noted that the lights were always preceded by silence on the grounds and followed by a distinct odor in the air, wax and what Braun described as singed feathers or scorched paper. Braun died in 1843 from septic fever. Nott, increasingly isolated, vanished a year later on his way to deliver a follow-up complaint. The final known visitor to the annex before its public closure in 1844 was Dr. Samuel Pelham, a medical archivist from New Haven. Invited to review the asylum's records, Pelham made detailed notes on the institution's organizational charts and treatment logs. Yet after examining the vaults, he left abruptly, citing personal emergency. His only surviving note regarding the visit read, "The records are not chronological. They loop." One entry references a future date, "The 7th shall rise, 1854. I cannot explain this." Later that year, the annex was officially decommissioned and sealed. The official reason cited was structural instability due to foundational rot. Sister Corinna was reassigned to administrative oversight. Her presence on the grounds became infrequent, but her name remained listed on all supply orders related to salt, ink, and linen. By then, fewer staff questioned these orders, yet whispers remained. A patient in the women's ward, age 37, described as formerly catatonic, began speaking again in late 1844. Her first words were, "The salt has kept the gate closed." She died 2 nights later of cardiac arrest. Her final recorded drawing was a semicircle of figures with key-shaped mouths. By 1845, references to the annex had been scrubbed from the public registry. Yet one final document, an unsigned internal memo, remained among archived asylum papers. It states plainly, "No further rotations through the lower levels. Access restricted to those carrying seal. R remains sacred." The year was 1846 when Reverend Alton Bellows arrived in Concord. A former Jesuit turned independent ecclesiastical investigator, Bellows had gained quiet notoriety in New York for exposing liturgical fraud in the rural outposts of Dutchess County. He had been summoned unofficially by a retired physician named Rutherford Ginn, who before his stroke had served on the New Hampshire Board of Charities. Ginn's final letter, smuggled out of his infirmary by a cousin, contained only one phrase, "They rehearse in silence, it's not prayer." Bellows visited the New Hampshire State Asylum without official sanction. He posed as a chaplain in training, having secured forged letters of introduction from a Connecticut seminary. His presence caused no alarm. The asylum was accustomed to rotating clergy. For the first 2 days he kept to assigned duties, assisting in morning recitations, observing meal protocols, and conducting small sessions of moral instruction. On the 3rd day, he requested access to the chapel's archive vaults. His request was denied with courtesy by Sister Corinna, who had returned to limited duties the previous year. He recorded his impressions in a leather-bound field diary, now housed in private custody. His early notes were methodical, even dry. Discipline observed, quiet to the point of unnatural. Sisters move as one body. No casual speech. Rooms abnormally clean. Atmosphere lacks warmth. On the 5th day, he noted a new detail. Vault stair sealed, yes, but the iron key remains near, no staff enter. A patient pointed and wept. That evening, Bellows conducted a quiet inspection of the granary wing. He descended the stairs behind the sealed annex, finding the passage chained but not locked. What he saw is only partially recorded. His entry reads, "Triangular scorch marks remain, parchment residue in corners, unbroken circle of salt, a feeling, hard to describe, pressure as though the air resists me." He withdrew before midnight. The next morning, his forged credentials were discovered missing from his room. A meeting was called by asylum administrators. Bellows was not reprimanded. He was invited to breakfast with Sister Corinna. She greeted him with a glass of warm milk and dry bread. They spoke of theology. She quoted Augustine. He quoted Ezekiel. Her eyes did not move once from his face. Bellows recorded, "She knows. She has seen it. She does not fear me." The following day, a page from his journal was torn out. The binding was undisturbed, but page 47 was cleanly removed. The next entry contained only this: "They knew it before I arrived." Around the same time, local newspaper editor William Tague began requesting information on asylum expenditures. Tague, a rigid abolitionist and regular contributor to the Concord Recorder, had grown curious about increasing orders of ink, linen, and unprocessed beeswax. He filed a formal inquiry in August of that year, citing irregularities in annual procurement logs. The asylum responded through its accounting officer, Hiram Cleaves, claiming the materials were standard religious supply for continued patient instruction. Yet when Tague followed up with supply merchants in Boston, 3 of them denied ever sending such goods. One claimed the invoices bore his name, but not his signature. Another said the quantities requested far exceeded what any convent would require, unless they were embalming bodies. Tague published nothing. 2 weeks later, he was found in his print shop, hands blistered and mouth scorched. The official report blamed faulty chemicals. His apprentice, who was the last to speak with him, said Tague had been trying to replicate a wax seal he had seen once, 3 crescents surrounding a vertical key. The apprentice was later dismissed and left Concord without notice. Meanwhile, Bellows continued his observations. He witnessed patients in Ward E forming into groups of 7 during their outdoor hour, despite strict supervision and no apparent communication. "They are not coerced," he wrote. "It is as if they remember something. They align their steps. They begin to hum." The sound, he claimed, resembled no known hymn or folk song. It lacks melody. It is repetition, a breathing rhythm without words. He attempted to record it in musical notation, but later tore the page from his diary. In October 1846, an attempt was made to contact the State Infirmary Board regarding the activities in the annex. The letter was intercepted. The asylum later issued a public statement declaring that no irregular rituals have taken place, and that any claim to the contrary stemmed from patients suffering from religious delusions. They referenced a newly added diagnosis, liturgical hallucinosis, used in 3 patient files that month alone. The following week, one of those patients, a 16-year-old girl named Eliza Dane, vanished from her room. Her door had been locked from the outside. The sheets were untouched, the window sealed. A nurse on duty said she saw Sister Corinna near the girl's wing shortly before midnight, holding what appeared to be a hymnal wrapped in cloth. No investigation followed. Bellows' final act was an attempted extraction. He arranged for a carriage to arrive under cover of dark, intending to remove 3 specific patients, all women between the ages of 15 and 19, who exhibited symptoms he labeled ritual memory disorder. The carriage never arrived. The driver was later found drowned in the river, with wax lodged beneath his fingernails. Bellows was escorted off the grounds the next morning. His diary ends abruptly. The final sentence reads, "I leave with more questions than when I came, but I leave knowing something sacred has been twisted here." His disappearance followed. Witnesses claimed he boarded a train to Boston. He was never seen again. No public inquiry was held. By the winter of 1847, new restrictions were implemented at the asylum. All staff were required to sign silence agreements. The chapel was closed for renovations. No religious services were held for over 5 months. Yet during that same period, patients continued to report hearing the same 3-word phrase during night hours, always spoken from below the floorboards: key, voice, rises. Construction records for the chapel renovations were incomplete. A single blueprint fragment shows an added substructure beneath the pulpit, a triangular foundation with one sealed corridor leading into the annex. It bears no labels, only a date, 1854. In early 1848, Concord's regional clerk, Charles Elroy, was instructed to conduct a routine cross-check of civil asylum records for the annual report to the governor's office. Elroy was known for his exacting standards and had previously uncovered fraudulent pension claims in neighboring counties. His audit began uneventfully until he reached the archive for 1835. There, he discovered discrepancies in 2 volumes of admissions ledgers. 47 names were listed in the asylum's internal registry, but did not appear in any external state reports. Elroy noted that these patients shared one common detail. All were transferred into the institution within 3 months of each other, and all had been assigned to the granary wing. He raised the issue with the asylum's records clerk, who denied any knowledge of the anomaly. Elroy, unsatisfied, returned later that week with a magistrate's letter granting temporary access to sealed documents. When he opened the corresponding case files, he found them completely redacted. Pages had been removed, patient names replaced with initials, and diagnoses overwritten in a uniform hand. The ink smelled faintly medicinal, and several of the documents had been sealed with black wax. The clerk, pale and trembling, admitted under pressure that the files had been altered under instruction from Sister Corinna's office. That evening, Elroy returned home and wrote to a Boston-based lawyer and reform advocate, Nathaniel Ricks. His letter was unusually urgent. The numbers do not lie. Something is hidden beneath that chapel. The foundation drawings contradict what stands above. Records have been removed. This is no mere clerical error. Ricks arrived 3 days later. Though not officially sanctioned, he carried the weight of his reputation. Known for his litigation against factory labor abuses in Lowell, Ricks was methodical and unflinching. Upon meeting with asylum staff, he requested a tour of the facility under the guise of writing a public health report. The visit was granted, and he was escorted by Administrative Assistant Harold Dorr, a thin, quiet man who had served at the institution for over a decade. Ricks was immediately struck by the silence in the corridors. Even the patients seemed subdued, their movements measured, their eyes fixed downward. He made note of Sister Corinna, whom he encountered in the west hallway. Her demeanor calm, her voice nearly inaudible, no visible age. As if preserved. He asked Dorr about the annex but was told it was no longer part of the living facility. Later, when Dorr momentarily stepped away, Ricks slipped down the eastern corridor, finding a narrow stair partially blocked by a linen cart. The iron door at the base was cold to the touch and bore no visible handle. He pressed his ear to the surface. Nothing. Yet upon standing, he noticed a set of 7 shallow depressions in the stone lintel above the frame. He took a rubbing of the indentations before leaving. 2 days later, Ricks attempted to file a complaint with the Concord Board of Health, citing serious irregularities and unreported patient fatalities. Before he could finalize the filing, his rented office was broken into and his notes taken. Only his rubbing survived, having been mailed ahead to Elroy. When Ricks returned to Boston, he fell ill within the week. He died before the month ended. The attending physician listed inflammatory lung infection. Elroy, who had continued pressing for an investigation, was found unconscious in his home the following spring, having ingested a mixture of ink and lye. Amid growing unease, a physician from Philadelphia, Dr. Bernard Forstall, was dispatched quietly by a reformist group under the guise of evaluating the asylum's moral treatment practices. His visit was logged without fanfare in late summer 1848. He remained on site for only 4 days. His report, recovered years later, is terse and fragmented but chilling. Patients exhibit memory of rituals not taught. Internal silence is cultivated. Figures of authority rarely contradict each other. Sisters, not nuns. Their clothing bears no denominational emblem. All wear same ring. Forstall made a sketch of the ring, a plain black band marked inside with a vertical line crossing 3 circles. He observed that it was never removed, even for surgical procedures or hygiene. When he asked one sister about its significance, she responded only, "It is part of the vow." The escalation of strange events peaked in the winter of 1849. A young teacher named Judith Mead, who had volunteered at the asylum to teach reading to select patients, disappeared. She had been seen entering the chapel archives shortly before her midday lesson. When she did not return, staff searched for her quietly. Her coat and scarf were found neatly folded beside a closed trapdoor near the old pulpit foundation. The trapdoor, according to construction records, was supposed to have been sealed with mortar 5 years prior. When questioned, no staff admitted to having opened it. The area beneath was inaccessible. No cry for help had been heard. Mead was never found. Her disappearance triggered a brief inquiry by the State Superintendent of Charitable Institutions, yet within 2 days the inquiry was halted. The official reason? No grounds for further concern, staff operating within expected moral bounds, no corroborated evidence of mistreatment. The file on Mead was marked closed. In the months that followed, asylum patients began exhibiting coordinated behaviors at precise intervals. At the stroke of 6 each evening, several would simultaneously fall to their knees, whispering the same phrase, "The seventh door." This pattern occurred across wards, regardless of age, condition, or treatment. When restraints were introduced, the behavior stopped, but so did all speech. Silence descended on the upper wards like a shroud. Sister Corinna resumed full supervisory duties by the end of 1849. No explanation was given. Her public role increased. She was now present at all administrative briefings, escorted visitors through the West Wing, and spoke at Concord's annual charitable luncheon in January 1850. She appeared unchanged, her posture rigid, voice measured, eyes steady. Her name began appearing in civic records under a new title, Director of Liturgical Affairs. No such title existed within the state asylum's hierarchy. Attempts to trace her background yielded nothing. No parish claimed her. No baptismal or ordination records could be found. A single census entry from 1820 lists a Corinna Duval in a Massachusetts convent, but the age and description do not match. It is as if her identity had been reconstructed, assembled solely for her function within the asylum. By spring, any mention of annex activity was purged from official logs. References to Wing G, the granary vault, and ritual programming were removed, yet orders for salt, ink, and wax continued, now tripled from previous years. One merchant in Boston wrote a puzzled note in his ledger. "The order is excessive. For what purpose is wax consumed at this volume? A church of 700 might use less." On the morning of September 14, 1851, a cold front swept through Concord, dropping the temperature abruptly and bringing a brittle stillness to the asylum grounds. That same morning, a portion of the chapel floor collapsed during routine maintenance. The collapse exposed a sub-level chamber previously undocumented in any architectural plan. The attending mason, Levi Brack, was the first to see it. A vaulted room dimly lit by cracks in the foundation, its walls coated in soot, salt encrusted at the base like frost. Brack backed away immediately, vomiting into a cloth and refusing to descend. Within an hour, Asylum Director Thomas Egrin convened a team of 3, physician Alcott Werry, grounds overseer Caleb Venz, and senior nurse Miriam Cleaves. They entered the space cautiously, using oil lamps and noting a peculiar resistance in the air, a heaviness that thickened with each step. Werry recorded the sensation as, "like walking through breath that doesn't belong to you." The room was narrow and triangular, perhaps 15 feet long on each wall, with vaulted corners that curved toward a domed ceiling. At the center stood a stone altar, waist-high, scorched around the edges, and fitted with 7 iron rings embedded in the floor. To the right, a small iron gate led to a secondary space, a passage no more than 4 feet wide and barely high enough to stand upright in. This second space contained no furnishings, only a single wall covered in wax-sealed ledgers stacked 6 rows high. Cleaves approached first. She touched one of the ledgers, noting the wax had softened slightly with body heat. When she lifted it from the shelf, the seal cracked with a sharp pop. Inside were entries written in multiple hands, dated from 1824 through 1849, none bearing patient names. Each page began the same way, Recipient R. The rest of the text varied, lines in Latin, French, sometimes Old English. One page simply read, "Voice repeated, salt accepted, memory binds." More alarming was the discovery made behind the altar. Venz, using a crowbar to pry up a loose flagstone, revealed a shallow pit no more than 2 feet deep. Lined with blackened cloth, it contained the remnants of 7 human forms, skeletal, fused with wax, the bones twisted into shapes inconsistent with burial. Each skull bore signs of deliberate flattening at the crown. Embedded into the wax were rings identical to those worn by the sisters, black bands etched with 3 circles and a vertical key. Cleves screamed and fell back. Venz dropped his lamp, cracking the glass and flooding the space with thick, sooty smoke. The smell of charred linen and old tallow filled the room. They exited quickly. Wary, trembling, kept the cracked ledger clutched to his chest as they ascended. That afternoon, the Concord Sheriff's Office was notified. Deputy Marcus Field arrived before dusk, with 3 additional officers and a town notary. Sister Corinna was not present during the visit. The staff claimed she had departed that morning for a religious retreat in Claremont. There was no record of such a retreat. Upon examination, Deputy Field noted inconsistencies between the chamber and the building's foundation. The vault had been constructed with different stone, older and more porous, and did not match the known blueprints. Field ordered a wider excavation around the pulpit, revealing a series of joined arches leading deeper beneath the chapel. The arches were dry, cold, and led to what appeared to be a circular chamber, entirely unlit. Its floor was covered in crushed bone and wax shavings, swept to the edges as if by repeated footfall. At the center stood a lectern, identical to the one seen in Almon Ware's lost daguerreotype from 1833. It was positioned before 7 small stools, each carved with initials ED, MQ, JM, AS, CW, LF, and a final mark, a triangle in place of letters. A bound book lay open on the lectern, its pages made not of parchment, but a coarse fiber that resisted the officer's touch. When Deputy Field tried to turn a page, it cracked like dry wood. Each leaf bore a different diagram. Concentric shapes, lines of text arranged into mirrored loops, repeated inscriptions in Latin. Lux absconditus, clavis intrat, septima portae. Field ordered the room sealed and placed a guard at the chapel entrance. Within 12 hours, the ledger and book had vanished. The guard, a young constable named Eric Folt, reported nothing unusual during his shift, except that his oil lamp had gone out shortly before dawn and would not relight. He claimed he remained at his post, but another witness, a patient from Ward A, saw a figure matching Folt's description leaving the chapel, carrying a bundle beneath his coat. Folt was questioned, then dismissed. He left town the same week. Panic began to spread within the staff. Nurse Cleves, who had handled the original ledger, developed severe burns on her palms. The skin peeled in long strips, revealing darkened tissue beneath. She was taken to the infirmary and confined in silence, refusing food and whispering only one phrase repeatedly, "The ink is inside me now." Director Egrin resigned the following morning. His letter, sent to the governor's office, made no mention of the events. Instead, he cited emotional depletion and the unbearable weight of institutional silence. When investigators returned to question him, his home was empty, his belongings gone. No travel records were filed. The remaining administrative staff offered no clear explanation. When asked about the bones, they called them old artifacts, likely predating the asylum. No mention was made of the rings, the sealed ledgers, or the chamber's architecture. When pressed further, a senior sister named Marguerite simply replied, "Some doors open inward. We do not knock." Public pressure began mounting. Articles began appearing in out-of-state journals. The Boston Register published a scathing editorial titled, "Silence at Concord, What Do They Bury in the Salt?" The Concord Recorder, still under new editorial control after William Taig's death, printed a brief denial, followed by a retraction. Letters from surviving family members of past patients flooded the county office, demanding access to records. Most received no reply. A final attempt to examine the site occurred in November 1851, led by a small team of independent physicians and architects hired by private citizens. They were granted access only after legal threats. Upon entering the chapel, they found the floor resealed, the altar removed, and the iron stair covered by a newly built dais. When they protested, they were informed by asylum administrators that all previous structures were deemed structurally unsound and have been safely removed. Yet one photograph remains. Taken in secret by one of the architects, it captures the interior of the chamber before it was sealed. In the image, the light is dim, but the salt line around the altar is clear. The figures in the wax pit are visible, their shapes indistinct but undeniable. Behind them, on the rear wall, a final symbol is faintly visible, a single key crossed by 3 lines. The sealing of the chamber in November 1851 did not mark the end of questions. It marked the beginning of a deeper silence. Public outcry continued through the winter, but the official channels gave no answers. Families of former patients were turned away at the gates. The names from the unaccounted ledger remained unacknowledged, and the chapel resumed weekly services as if nothing had changed. Inside the asylum, a shift took place. Staff members who had witnessed the excavation were quietly dismissed or reassigned. Nurse Miriam Cleaves was transferred to a sanitarium in Vermont. She died 3 weeks later, found lying face down in a salt-lined circle in the corner of her room, her palms still bandaged. The physician who filed her death report noted without explanation that all the glass in the infirmary had fogged over in the hour before her passing. Of the original discovery team, only Caleb Venz remained on the grounds. He refused to speak publicly, but one of the janitors, a man named Chester Lane, claimed to have seen him digging alone behind the granary one morning before dawn. Lane described Venz as disheveled, his eyes rimmed with black, and his fingers wrapped in fabric soaked with a dark oil. When asked what he was burying, Venz reportedly answered, "What should not have been touched?" Lane was dismissed from the asylum days later for fabrication of incidents designed to alarm staff. The governor's office, facing increasing pressure, dispatched a single investigator, Horace Mayfield, a lawyer from Portsmouth with no prior medical experience. Mayfield arrived in January 1852. He conducted brief interviews with staff, all of whom adhered to an almost identical account. The room had been part of an abandoned root cellar, the bones animal in origin, the objects deteriorated and misidentified. No mention was made of the wax, the ring-marked remains, or the ledgers. Mayfield requested to speak with Sister Corinna. He was told she had left permanently for a convent in Quebec. No records of such a convent could be located. A week later, Mayfield was found unconscious on the train platform at Exeter, clutching a torn piece of black cloth and mumbling in fragments, "3 keys. Voice made of salt. They never closed it." He recovered partially but resigned his post. His final written note, delivered anonymously to a Concord newspaper editor, read, "They do not fear exposure because their ritual is the silence. You cannot indict what erases its own trail." Among the few physical artifacts to survive was the rubbing taken by Nathaniel Ricks in 1848, the 7 crescent notches above the iron door. An archivist at the Concord Historical Office, Lydia North, compared it to old liturgical symbols and discovered a similarity to a band configuration used in 17th century monastic orders. A ritual architecture designed not for entry, but containment. A design built not to welcome faith, but to hold something in place. Her notes and tracing were sent to a Boston university for analysis. They were never returned. With the chamber resealed, attention slowly waned, but subtle changes in the asylum did not stop. By mid-1852, patient behavior across multiple wards reflected a disturbing coherence. The humming returned, soft, rhythmic, always beginning just before evening meal. Staff tried to disrupt the pattern with noise and sedation, but the patients continued, often mouthing the same 3-syllable word, impossible to trace in language. It was described by one attending physician as like a name spoken backwards through water. In a closed-door meeting held on August 7th, asylum directors convened with a state legal advisor and 2 clergy representatives from the New England Reformed Church. The minutes of the meeting were never recorded. However, an assistant named Julian Forry, who delivered documents to the room, later told his brother he had seen something unusual. They all stood before they spoke. Each waited for the sister to nod. There was no debate, only agreement. No legislation or public report followed that meeting, but a month later a new internal division was created within the asylum. Its purpose was not publicly disclosed, but supply orders increased significantly. More wax, more black linen, and a new item: wooden keys carved without teeth, 7 inches long. They were listed as symbolic instruments for patient therapy. The Black Mass archive was never acknowledged by name, yet in an offhand mention within a mid-year budget report from 1853, one line item listed liturgical rehearsal furnishings, vault storage, continued. The word rehearsal appeared again in an unrelated procurement form requesting additional lighting for the chapel's foundation level. Meanwhile, unexplained disappearances continued. A laundress named Eloise Varn failed to appear for her shift. Her quarters were in perfect order, the bed made, her shoes placed neatly under the frame. On her nightstand was a folded piece of parchment bearing 3 hand-drawn rings and a vertical line. The ink had bled into the paper. The room smelled faintly of burned herbs. No report was filed. Staff were instructed not to discuss the matter. Later that autumn, a physician attempting to inventory medical records discovered a gap. Every patient admitted between 1824 and 1836 had been removed from the system. Only the page numbers remained, handwritten in different ink, as if the names had been excised with purpose. He brought this to the attention of administration. 3 days later, he tendered his resignation, citing irreconcilable differences with institutional doctrine. In December 1853, one final incident forced the reactivation of state oversight. A group of asylum patients, confined in separate wings, attempted to access the sealed chapel simultaneously. They moved in silence, barefoot, each carrying an object, scraps of paper, burnt cloth, one with a small wooden key. They were intercepted before reaching the annex, but all refused to speak afterward. When examined by physicians, their pupils were dilated, their pulse steady, their expressions fixed and serene. When questioned, one patient, a former clerical secretary, admitted after a psychotic break, whispered, "It begins again in the hour of wax. The 7th mouth has not closed." He died 2 days later in his sleep, though no illness had been reported. The physician who signed his death certificate later wrote privately, "They do not behave like the insane. They behave like initiates." By the end of that year, new locks were placed on the sub-level entrances, but keys were distributed only to 2 unnamed staff. A final order, dated February 1, 1854, was issued under the name C. Duval, though no one by that name was listed on payroll or personnel rolls. The document authorized the complete resealing of the vaults beneath the chapel, the destruction of unauthorized ledgers, and the cessation of all documentation relating to the liturgical division. The order was obeyed. The salt was reapplied, the walls repainted, the records rewritten. But beneath it all the stones remained, soot darkened and dusted with wax. In the spring of 1854, under mounting pressure from outside clergy, journalists, and civic reformers, the New Hampshire State Assembly convened a special investigative committee to address the mounting allegations tied to the Concord Asylum. The hearings were held quietly, behind closed doors, and attended only by a select group of legal observers and representatives from the governor's office. No press was admitted, no minutes were published. Testimonies were taken from 10 individuals, all under oath. 4 were former asylum employees. 3 had left voluntarily. 2 had been dismissed for failure to conform to silence protocols. 1, identified in records only as T. Lane, was escorted into the chamber by military personnel and bore visible marks on both wrists and around the neck. His statements were not included in the final report. It was said that he began to chant mid-testimony and could not be stopped until removed by force. The official report, issued June 3, 1854, was a single page. It stated that while certain practices had taken place that may appear irregular in contemporary moral light, no criminal wrongdoing could be confirmed, and that all structural anomalies had since been addressed. The asylum, the report concluded, had operated within the evolving boundaries of religious therapy and was in full compliance with the standards of the time. No arrests were made, no closures enacted. The chapel remained open. Governor Elias Mortmain, pressed by constituents for transparency, issued a statement calling the case an unfortunate convergence of rumor and architectural confusion. He later vetoed a bill that would have instituted mandatory external reviews of all state-run institutions. Mortmain would be re-elected in 1855 by a wide margin. Privately, several committee members resigned their posts. One, a judge named Orrin Halde, left the state entirely. His resignation letter, discovered years later in a personal archive, contained a single line beneath his signature: "What is preserved beneath stone has been preserved for a reason." The asylum continued operation under reduced scrutiny. A new director, Henry Talbot, was appointed in 1856. Talbot made minimal changes to staffing and allowed the chapel to fall into gradual disuse, citing lack of attendance. It was formally decommissioned in 1858 and used thereafter for storage. But inside Concord, the case lingered. Local families whose relatives had been committed during the 1820s and 30s began demanding access to burial records. In most cases, the graves could not be found. A city clerk, Wesley Grant, began an unofficial map of the grounds based on surviving maintenance logs. He marked 37 unaccounted-for burial sites. In 1860, he published his findings in a small-run pamphlet titled The Absent Dead. He disappeared later that year during a routine trip to retrieve records from the asylum. His body was never recovered. The asylum's population dwindled during the war years. With the influx of wounded soldiers and psychiatric cases from battle trauma, new institutions were prioritized, and the Concord Asylum became a repository for the aging and the unwanted. The original sisters gradually disappeared from the staff rolls. By 1865, none remained, and yet elements of their presence endured. Each spring, 7 fresh black flowers, never identified, never purchased, were found placed evenly along the rear chapel wall. Groundskeepers began clearing them without discussion. Eventually, they were left to wither naturally. The community responded with measured distance. Stories began circulating among children, of voices beneath the bricks, of black candles burning without flame, of figures standing at chapel windows that no longer opened. Most were dismissed as folklore, but older residents avoided walking near the western wall after sunset. In 1872, a fire broke out in the main archives room. The flames were contained quickly, but one cabinet was completely lost. It had housed ledgers from the years 1824 through 1834, precisely the decade referenced by earlier whistleblowers. The cause of the fire was never determined. The official report listed it as accidental combustion from oil lamp. The chapel, long unused, was bricked over in 1876. No ceremony was held. A short note was entered into the ledger by then-director Alfred Keene. Room no longer relevant to the institution's aims. That same year, the foundation began to crack on its southern end. It was patched with lime and stone. By the 1880s, the asylum had changed hands twice. The new administrators adopted more modern, secular treatment methods. The term ritual therapy was removed from patient charts. Wax was no longer ordered in bulk. The wooden keys were no longer produced, but one remained, found decades later in a rusted drawer behind the infirmary stove. It bore a smooth surface, no teeth, and the initials CD faintly etched beneath the varnish. In 1892, a journalist named Lenore Axton published a serialized report in a small Boston paper titled The Vault Beneath. Drawing on interviews with surviving staff and relatives of former patients, she recounted the Black Mass archive, the missing records, and the sealed chamber. Her articles drew attention briefly. Then the paper ceased publication without warning, and Axton withdrew from public life. She never published again. No official recognition of the events was ever made, yet fragments endured. A staff handbook from 1894 contained a passage advising night nurses to avoid unnecessary disturbance of sub-level stonework near the original chapel. A patient sketchbook from the same year included 7 near-identical symbols, a vertical line crossing 3 circles, drawn again and again until the page turned black with ink. And in the very last ward ledger before the asylum's transition to modern administration, one final entry was scrawled in red ink along the bottom margin: "Salt holds. Do not reopen. Voice sleeps for now." For now. In 1895, the original chapel foundation, once the core of the Black Mass archive, was absorbed into a new structural renovation project intended to modernize the western wing of the Concord Asylum. Architectural firms arrived with fresh plans and contractors unfamiliar with the site's history. Stone was broken, tiles lifted. The triangle-shaped vaults were rediscovered briefly, documented in 2 surveyors' sketches, then sealed once again under orders from institutional administrators. The workers who uncovered the substructure did not speak publicly. Their wages were quietly doubled for the duration of the project. One man, Thomas Bell, later told a local grocer that he had found bones beneath the salt-packed corners and that the wax doesn't rot, it just waits. Bell moved to Massachusetts shortly after and was never seen in Concord again. By 1896, the chapel space had been completely erased. What remained was a clean, white-tiled room used for medical storage. No markings, no plaques. The walls bore no trace of the soot or salt once embedded into the mortar. But when an electric line was installed through the subfloor that winter, the contractor reported that his drill refused to penetrate a patch of stone near the room's center. He tried a second bit, which snapped. He marked the spot in chalk, 7 inches wide, slightly triangular, cool to the touch. Nothing further was done. The asylum, now renamed Concord State Hospital, continued to function into the early 20th century. Over the next decade, the building would see the introduction of new wards, the removal of archaic treatment equipment, and the adoption of scientific psychiatric practices. The chapel was not restored. The staff who had once whispered about Sister Corinna and the rituals beneath the vaults had either retired or passed on. Yet a subtle caution persisted in institutional routine. New employees were told not to walk alone in the western corridor at night. Custodians were instructed to avoid deep cleaning the storage level, citing delicate tiling. The practice of keeping black garments for certain administrative roles, though outdated, remained part of the internal dress code until 1901. When asked why, an aging records clerk reportedly answered, "We honor our archive, even if we do not speak of it." In the decades that followed, traces of the Black Mass archive faded into rumor. Local historians speculated, but no documents could be officially linked to any remaining records. The wax-sealed ledgers, if they survived, were never produced. The phrase "recipient R," once present in early ledger rubbings, vanished from all medical notations. But in 1899, the final year still within the reach of original witnesses, one last entry appeared in the hospital's private log, an internal ledger kept by staff supervisors, not intended for state reporting. The entry, dated October 31st, described an incident involving a new intern assigned to patient records. According to the log, the intern, whose name was later redacted, entered the supply room in the former chapel wing to retrieve shelving documents. After 20 minutes without return, a nurse checked on him. The room was empty, though the door had not opened again. The light was still on. On the floor lay a single piece of aged paper. It was blank, save for one mark in the center. 3 black circles intersected by a vertical line, drawn in what appeared to be thick wax. The report was not filed with state authorities. No missing person record was opened. The supervising staff simply closed the entry with one final line. "Confirmed breach, seal compromised, await further instruction." After 1900, the logs resumed normal activity. No further references were made to the seal, the archive, or the vault beneath the original chapel. But among a collection of misfiled blueprints in the basement of the Concord Historical Society, one page survives, unsigned, undated, nearly brittle with age. It contains a floor plan of the western wing as it was in 1824. In the lower right corner, a shape is faintly drawn. It is a triangle, blackened at the edges, with 7 rings arranged in a circle at its center, and beside it, written in ink so faint it can only be seen when held to the light, is a final sentence. The voice rises again when the salt forgets its place. If this story moved you, if you made it to the end, it's because you also feel that these hidden truths must come to light. Let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. That way we'll know how far these stories reach. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering them. This story was reconstructed from documents that were found. All names have been changed to protect the source.